She came back with nothing but a secret. I gave her shelter, with one unbreakable rule, the truth. But the past she brought with her has a name, and he just stepped back into our lives. I used to believe that if I just held on tight enough, everything would eventually settle. Like weathering a storm inside a house you built yourself. Maybe the shutters rattle, the lights flicker, but the foundation holds. That belief kept me going through a cold marriage, a bruising divorce, and the long, aching silence that followed my daughter's growing absence. But nothing prepares you for the day you realize the storm was always inside. My name is Linda Whitaker, 63 years old, retired social worker, and resident of a quiet street in Dayton, Ohio. The house I live in, a modest two-bedroom colonial with chipping white shutters and a wraparound porch, was my post-divorce salvation. It's not much, but I picked every tile, every brushstroke of paint. It's mine. And until 2 weeks ago, I thought my future was secure. The day it happened was unremarkable at first. I'd made myself a second cup of coffee, sat down to pay bills, and logged into the joint emergency account I'd created when Violet turned 18. She never contributed to it, but I kept her name on it, thinking, hoping, she'd feel a sense of responsibility. Or maybe it was a tether, a way to say, we're still connected. The balance was zero, not a missing chunk, not an overdraft. Zero, a single transfer out, marked 5 days prior, $180,000 gone in a blink. At first, I thought it was a mistake. I blinked, refreshed, logged out, logged back in, but there it was. Emptiness staring back at me. My hand flew to my mouth as my breath caught, nausea rising in my throat. I didn't cry, not then. Shock has a way of holding tears hostage. And then came the name. I pulled the bank statement. The transfer authorization had her name on it. Violet Marie Whitaker. Violet, my only child. My daughter who hadn't visited in over a year, who once told me in a screaming fit that she wished I'd disappeared like her father. Who'd spent her 20s chasing chaos in every form, bad men, worse jobs, and silence when I called. And yet, I had left that account open, just in case. I sat on the couch, still in my robe, unable to move. Hours passed. The day turned to dusk. Shadows stretched across the floor, and I watched them like they were answers. I felt a weight pressed down on me, not just a betrayal, but of a kind of finality. Like I'd been holding on to a version of Violet that had never existed, and now I couldn't lie to myself anymore. The next morning I called Rachel. Rachel and I had been friends since nursing school. She'd stayed in Dayton, worked her way into administration, retired last year. Tall, sharp-witted, with a laugh that could cut through fog. She came over without asking, let herself in, and sat down beside me like she'd been waiting for this moment. "You can't let her do this to you," she said. No preamble, just steel. "You're allowed to be angry. You need to be." "I'm her mother," I whispered. The words tasted sour. Rachel reached for my hand. Being her mother doesn't mean being her victim. But I didn't know who I was if I wasn't trying to fix things. That's how I'd survived the marriage, patching holes, softening blows. Alan, her father, had drained something out of me long before Violet did. Maybe that's why I held so tightly to her. Maybe that's why I missed the signs. I couldn't bring myself to call Violet. Not yet. The silence between us felt like standing at the edge of a canyon, unsure if calling out would bring an echo or an avalanche. In the following days, I found myself drifting, washing dishes I hadn't used, rearranging framed photos, then hiding them all together. I couldn't bear to look at her face in those pictures, smiling, 5 years old, frosting on her cheeks. Where had that girl gone? At night, the walls felt too thin. I'd hear things that weren't there. A door creak, a footstep, my own heartbeat in my ears. And yet, I told no one else. Not the police, not the bank, not Violet. Because saying it out loud made it real. And part of me, the maternal part, still clung to hope. Maybe she'd come back. Maybe there was a reason. Maybe she didn't mean to. But the account was gone, and I was left with the echo of my own choices. 1 week later, Rachel came by again. She brought groceries even though I hadn't asked. While we unpacked, she said it softly, like testing the water. "You should talk to someone." "A therapist," I almost laughed. "I am someone people used to talk to." "That's not the same," she said. "You've been strong for so long, you don't even recognize when you're drowning." That night, I sat alone with the statement again. Printed, not digital. I wanted to feel the paper in my hand, to make it tangible. And that's when the rage came. Not a scream, not a crash, just hot tears, silent and relentless. I'd worked 40 years to save that money, through overtime shifts, weekend call-ins, clipped coupons, and skipped vacations. Every dollar was a brick in the house I hoped to leave behind for her, and she tore it down without a second thought. Still, I couldn't shake the guilt. The voice inside that said, maybe I hadn't done enough. Maybe I wasn't enough. The foundation hadn't just cracked, it had collapsed, and I had to decide. Was I going to live in the ruins or rebuild? Some pain doesn't come crashing through like thunder. It settles in like fog, slow, quiet, impossible to name until you're already choking on it. That was my childhood, and until I sat alone in my living room clutching a photo album with trembling hands, I didn't realize how much of it I had passed on. I was raised by a woman who never smiled with her eyes. Eleanor Whitaker believed discipline was love and silence was strength. I remember sitting at our kitchen table, fork in hand, her gaze burning into me because I hadn't folded my napkin properly. Emotions were weaknesses. Joy was frivolous. Obedience was sacred. By 15, I had mastered the art of disappearing, shrinking into corners, speaking only when asked. I didn't cry when she slapped me for being late. I didn't flinch when she called me a disappointment. I learned to hold pain like a secret. I thought I escaped her when I married Alan, but in truth, I just found a more charming version of the same cruelty. Alan was quick with compliments in public, but behind closed doors, he ruled with implication and silence. He'd never raise his voice. He didn't need to. Disapproval dripped from every word, every look. He decided where we lived, how we spent money, even what I wore to his work events. I was a reflection, not a person. When Violet was born, I made a vow. I would be the mother I never had. I would give her softness. I would let her speak. I would love her no matter what. But somewhere along the way, that vow turned into something else. I couldn't say no. I couldn't risk being the cold shadow my mother had been. So I bent. When Violet screamed and slammed doors, I quieted myself. When she dropped out of school, I paid for community college. When she cursed at me, I cleaned her sheets and left money on the counter. The guilt was always there, this gnawing voice inside that said maybe her brokenness was my fault. Maybe I hadn't protected her from Alan enough. Maybe the bruises he left on her spirit were ones I should have absorbed. But guilt has a way of rotting the roots of love. What I gave her wasn't strength, it was permission. And I called it protection. Now I sit on the floor, photo albums spread around me like puzzle pieces of a life I can't put back together. My fingers brush against a picture of Violet on her 5th birthday, party hat crooked, eyes wide with delight. The image shakes in my hand. Rachel had stopped by earlier that day. She found me like that, surrounded by the past. "You're torturing yourself," she said, easing down beside me. "I just don't know where I went wrong," I whispered. Rachel pulled a picture from the pile. Violet at 17, arms crossed, jaw set, already halfway gone. "You didn't go wrong. You went too far trying to be what your mother wasn't." I swallowed. "Isn't that what we're supposed to do?" "Not if it means losing yourself," she said, sharper now. "Love doesn't mean letting her destroy you." I wanted to argue, but my chest was tight with truth. The sun had gone down by the time Rachel left. I stayed in that spot, lost in the fading faces. The house was still, the kind of stillness that feels like a held breath. Then came the knock. 3 soft raps against the door. I froze, my heart stuttered. Another knock, louder. I stood slowly, knees stiff, a pulse rising in my throat. When I opened the door, Violet was there, disheveled, pale, and visibly pregnant. She didn't say anything, just stared at me with eyes I couldn't read. My mouth opened, but no words came. I looked from her face to her stomach, and the world shifted. There was a secret in her silence, and it was just beginning to unravel. She stood there, arms crossed under the swell of her stomach, looking like a shadow of the daughter I once knew. She hadn't called, hadn't written, hadn't answered any of my voicemails, not even after the money vanished. And yet here she was, face drawn, lips tight. shivering slightly on my front porch as if the past year hadn't happened. I don't have anywhere else to go, Mom. The silence between us stretched. She looked thinner, paler. Her hair was pulled back with an elastic that barely held. No makeup, no smile, the kind of raw a person doesn't fake. I'm broke. I haven't eaten since yesterday morning. I've been sleeping in my car. She blinked, but no tears came. I knew that look. It was pride doing battle with desperation. And desperation had won. I stepped back. Come inside. She moved slowly, as if waiting for me to change my mind. She paused at the doorway, eyes scanning the house like it was foreign. I noticed her fingers trembled as she wrapped them around her coat sleeves. I set a cup of tea in front of her, barely filled. She glanced at it but didn't touch it. Before you say anything, I began, my voice sharper than I intended. There's a condition. Her head tilted. You stay here, you tell me the truth, all of it, and you go to therapy every day. Her eyes narrowed. Every day? Yes. She let out a breath, like a tire slowly deflating. You don't trust me? No, I said, I don't. For a long moment, she didn't respond. Then with a reluctant nod, she whispered, Fine. That night, we sat at the dinner table. Just the two of us, a half-cooked casserole between us. The air was thick with unsaid things. She pushed her peas around. I tried not to stare. Every sound, the clink of a fork, the scrape of a chair, felt magnified. I'm seeing someone from the clinic, she mumbled. I raised an eyebrow. The baby's father? She shook her head. No. That was all she offered. Later that night, I started a journal. I hadn't written like that in years, but something inside told me I needed to understand, to survive. Entry 1. I don't know what's more painful, losing everything or pretending I haven't. I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror before bed. The years sat heavy on my face. My mother's voice rang in my ears. You let people walk all over you, Linda. You're too soft. I wasn't soft. I was tired. The next morning, as I stood by the mailbox, Caleb waved from his porch. He was trimming his rose bushes, as usual. Widowed 5 years now. We spoke sometimes, mostly about weather and raccoons getting into the trash. Visitor? He asked. I nodded. Daughter? I nodded again. He tilted his head. Something feels off. She didn't even look me in the eye. She's been through a lot, I said, not sure who I was trying to convince. Yeah, he replied, setting down his shears. So have you. That night, Violet asked if she could stay until the baby came. That depends, I said. On what? On whether you're really here or just hiding. She didn't answer. It didn't take long for the atmosphere in the house to shift. What began as cautious civility curdled into something far more insidious. Violet moved in like a shadow, quiet, moody, ungrateful. She dropped her duffel bag on the floor and, without asking, claimed the guest room. Her presence filled every room, not with warmth, but with static. The house felt smaller, airless. Our routines clashed. I would cook breakfast only to find the eggs untouched and the cereal boxes left open on the counter. Dishes piled up, lights were left on, doors slammed. Her silence was louder than any argument. She didn't go to therapy the first day or the second. By the third, I confronted her gently, reminding her of the agreement. She rolled her eyes and said, What's the point of talking to a stranger who doesn't care? I reminded her of our deal. Her voice cracked just slightly when she said, Fine. Tomorrow. But tomorrow kept slipping. My instinct was to smooth it over, make excuses. Maybe she's adjusting. Maybe she's scared. Maybe I'm still trying to be the mother I never had. Late one night, I found myself picking up her mess, her takeout containers, her laundry. My hands trembled with the weight of déjà vu. I was doing it again, cleaning up chaos that didn't belong to me, absorbing a silence that screamed. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table and opened the leather-bound journal I hadn't touched in years. Rachel had brought it over last week, said it was time I started writing again. I uncapped the pen and stared at the page for a long time before writing. I don't recognize her, or myself. The act of writing unlocked memories I'd buried so deep they'd almost fossilized. I saw Violet as a toddler, her face red with rage during tantrums that left me on my knees. I saw Alan's sneer as he said, "She gets it from you." I saw myself, younger, thinner, terrified, begging my husband to just help, just once. He didn't. He never did. Instead, I did what I was taught. I hushed, I managed, I sacrificed. That's what I learned from my own mother, a woman so icy she made compliments sound like criticisms. I remember her standing over me in the kitchen, correcting how I stirred the batter, her voice clipped and cold. No man wants a wife who doesn't follow directions. That lesson stayed with me, not because I believed it, but because I never unlearned it. The more Violet pushed, the more I gave. But it wasn't love, it was fear. Fear that if I didn't give enough, she'd leave. Or worse, she'd turn out like me. On the fourth day, she finally went to therapy. When she returned, she didn't speak. Just marched into the kitchen and microwaved leftover pizza, leaving the box wide open and grease-stained on the counter. "I'd appreciate it if you could clean up after yourself," I said softly. Her eyes snapped to mine, sharp and brimming. "You never loved me unless I was perfect." The words stopped me cold. My mouth opened, then closed. My heart raced. That sentence, it wasn't just hers, it was mine. It was what I used to whisper to myself as a child, lying in bed after one of my mother's silent punishments. It was the echo of a legacy I never meant to pass down. Later that evening, I sat in my room and pulled out the therapist's notes she'd left on the counter. I don't think she meant for me to read them, but I did. Words like projection, parental mirroring, codependent patterns jumped out at me. I read it all. Twice, I saw myself in every sentence. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind scratch against the windows. I thought about Rachel's words. Love doesn't mean letting her destroy you. I thought about Violet's scream, and I thought about my mother. The next morning, I resolved to stop enabling. I told Violet therapy wasn't optional anymore. I reminded her of our deal, of the condition that brought her here. She didn't fight me this time. Just nodded, arms crossed, eyes tired. It felt like something had shifted just slightly. That evening, while taking out the trash, I noticed Caleb across the street trimming the edges of his lawn. He gave me a small nod. We hadn't talked much, but there was something grounding about him, quiet, observant, the kind of man who noticed things most people ignored. As I walked back inside, I found Violet on the porch, hunched over her phone. Her face tensed when she saw me. "You all right?" I asked. She nodded too quickly. "Just texting." I glanced at the screen by accident, or maybe I didn't. A single message glared back before she tucked it away. "Stick to the plan, don't tell her yet." I said nothing, just walked inside, but my stomach turned with dread. Later, after Violet had gone to bed, I called Rachel. "I think something's wrong," I whispered. "What happened?" "There's a message, a plan, she's hiding something." Rachel's voice was quiet. "I'll come by tomorrow." And she did. The next morning, she stood in my kitchen, steaming mug in hand, staring at me with narrowed eyes. "I did something," she said slowly. "Something you might not like." I braced myself. I checked her social media. I found something odd. "What?" "She's been messaging Alan, your ex. Her father." I felt my knees buckle. I sat down before I could fall. "She reached out to him last month," Rachel continued. "Repeatedly, he responded." The world slowed. The air grew thin. Alan, the man who belittled me, who manipulated Violet, who disappeared the moment the child support ended. What would she want from him? I whispered. Rachel didn't answer. She didn't need to. I knew the answer. Or at least I feared it. The plan wasn't hers alone. And I was standing in the middle of it. I waited until the sun dipped below the horizon before I finally said the words that had been sitting on my tongue like a rusted nail. "Tell me the truth, Violet, about your father." She was standing in the hallway, arms crossed, pretending not to shake. For a moment, I saw her as she was at 8 years old, small, stubborn, trembling beneath the weight of things too heavy for her shoulders. "I don't know what you mean." she said flatly, eyes darting away. Don't lie to me. I saw the messages. Rachel found them. You've been talking to Alan. The name landed like a stone between us. Her eyes widened for a second, and then she dropped her gaze, folding in on herself. Her voice came out cracked, defensive. It wasn't like that. Then what was it like? She took a step back, her hand going to the railing behind her like she needed support. I was broke. I had nowhere to go. I thought maybe he could help. You thought the man who emotionally gutted both of us would save you? I didn't know where else to turn. I moved closer, not out of anger, but desperation. So you asked him for money? And he gave you what? An idea? A plan? She nodded slowly, tears forming at the edges. He said he had an opportunity, a deal. He made it sound real. Like if I helped him, it would all work out. I just had to front the money. He said he couldn't be tied to anything legally, but he swore he'd pay me back. The air left my lungs. I sat on the edge of the stairs and stared at the wood grain beneath my feet. You gave him everything, I said quietly. My savings, your future. She slid down to the floor across from me, her knees drawn to her chest. I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't think he'd disappear, again. I looked at her then, not the defiant woman who'd slammed doors, but the broken child who still wanted to believe her father could be anything but a monster. And I saw it clearly. The cycle, the generational wound, the manipulations passed down like heirlooms. He's been doing this to both of us for a long time, I whispered. You were just too young to see it then. I was too afraid to stop it. She looked up, tears streaming freely now. I was scared. I know, I said. So was I. Something in her broke, or maybe it finally surfaced. She let out a sound I hadn't heard in years, a sob so raw it bypassed language. I reached for her without thinking, and she collapsed into my arms, both of us shaking, gasping through years of grief and guilt. We sat there, mother and daughter, surrounded by the wreckage of silence and sacrifice, and cried until we couldn't anymore. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something. When we finally pulled apart, her voice was hoarse. Why did you stay with him so long? I swallowed hard. Because I didn't know who I was without him. Because I thought if I could just keep things together, you'd grow up safe. I didn't realize until it was too late that staying was doing more damage than leaving ever could. She nodded, not in agreement, but in understanding. I stood and walked to the hallway closet. From a faded envelope tucked between old files, I pulled out a photo. The three of us, years ago. Alan with his perfect smile, his arm wrapped around me like a noose. Violet, maybe 5, perched on his knee, grinning. It was a lie in glossy print. I held the photo over the kitchen sink. My fingers trembled as I struck a match. The flame licked the corner, then devoured it whole. I watched Alan's face curl into ash. Violet gasped softly behind me, but she didn't stop me. When it was nothing but char, I turned to her. No more, I said. We've both been his victims long enough? She nodded again, this time steadier. What now? I looked out the window, to the dusk beyond the trees. Now we start telling the truth, to each other, to the law, to ourselves. Later that night, I pulled out the old manila folder labeled Divorce Proceedings. Inside, among custody documents and restraining orders, was the memory I tried hardest to forget. The night I finally left him. He'd slapped Violet, just once, but hard, and in that single moment the illusion shattered. I'd packed our bags, driven to Rachel's, and called the police before dawn. I remembered sitting in the courthouse with my hand over Violet's, promising her it would never happen again. And now, here we were, years later, different house, same wounds, but maybe this time we had a chance to stop the bleeding. I had rehearsed the call to the authorities in my head 100 times, but when I finally made it, my voice still trembled. Not from uncertainty, but from exhaustion. I was done pretending that love meant silence. Reporting Violet wasn't about vengeance. It was about clarity. It was about finally choosing myself. The officer on the other end of the line was calm, methodical, detached. I gave them everything. account details, transaction history, timelines, and when they asked who the suspect was, I said her name without stuttering. Violet Whitaker, my daughter. When I hung up, I sat alone in the kitchen listening to the tick of the wall clock. I'd done it. The foundation of everything I thought made me a good mother had cracked wide open, and I'd walked through it. That evening, I told Violet, "You called the cops on me?" She hissed, pacing the living room like a caged animal. "You called the cops on your own daughter?" I stayed seated, grounded. "I reported a crime because it was one I did it for him," she shouted. "I thought he'd help me. I didn't think—" "No, you didn't," I interrupted, "and I can't keep protecting you from consequences." Tears gathered at the corners of her eyes, but her jaw stayed tight. "I thought you said you forgave me." "I did," I said gently, "but forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting. And accountability is love too, Violet." That sentence hung in the air like a verdict. She didn't scream again. She just left the room, closing the door behind her with a soft, final click. It was the quiet that scared me more. The next morning, Rachel came over, a stack of folders in hand. We sat at the dining table, our coffee cooling untouched, as she helped me file a fraud claim with the bank. She'd printed everything: statements, screenshots, copies of Violet's messages to Alan. It felt clinical, like building a case against someone I used to rock to sleep. "I also helped you open a new secure account," Rachel said, sliding a set of login details toward me. "No one but you has access this time." I nodded, grateful and hollow. For a few days, Violet didn't speak much, but then, quietly, she began going to therapy again. Not out of obligation, but intention. I noticed the change in how she moved. Less storm, more shadow. Her new therapist, Dr. Latham, came highly recommended. Rachel had pulled some strings. The woman was everything I couldn't be for Violet: sharp, grounded, compassionate without being indulgent. The first time I met her, it was purely accidental. I had gone to pick Violet up, and Dr. Latham met me in the waiting room. "She's showing up," she said, a clipboard tucked under her arm. "That matters." I nodded, unsure whether to believe it. "She's angry," Dr. Latham added, "but anger is a mask." "For what?" I asked. "Grief," she said. "Your daughter is grieving the childhood she didn't understand she lost, grieving the father she wanted and the mother she blamed." "And what about me?" I asked before I could stop myself. Dr. Latham gave me a long look. "You're grieving too, but you're further along. You've stopped lying to yourself." That stayed with me. Later that week, I found Violet in the backyard, sitting on the porch steps, her knees pulled up. She looked smaller than usual, tired but calm. "Therapy helping?" I asked, approaching with a glass of water. She took it but didn't drink. "She said something weird today." "What's that?" "She said my anger is grief in armor." I sat beside her. "Sounds right." Violet stared ahead into the darkening trees. "It feels like if I let the anger go, there won't be anything left." "I used to think that too," I said softly, "but sometimes letting go isn't losing, it's making room." She didn't respond, but she didn't leave either. The house began to settle into a fragile rhythm. We spoke cautiously, shared meals, passed each other like two people on a tightrope, afraid of slipping but learning balance. I didn't let my guard down, but I allowed space for hope to breathe. Then Caleb came by one afternoon, his expression tight. "I found something behind the shed," he said, holding up a battered phone. It was scorched on the edges, but still functional. The burner Alan had used, left on my property. "How do you know it's his?" I asked, taking it with shaking hands. Caleb's jaw clenched. His number popped up on my caller ID a few weeks ago. I didn't answer, but I recognized the area code, same one from the messages Violet showed me. I opened the phone. One message still sat in the inbox, unread. "Don't let her ruin this." "She owes you." My blood went cold. "He's still out there," I whispered. Caleb nodded, still pulling strings, still playing his game. I took the phone inside and locked it away. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I kept replaying Alan's voice in my head, the way he twisted guilt into loyalty, anger into control. but nothing prepared me for what happened the next morning. A plain white envelope had been shoved under my front door. No stamp, no address. Inside was a single piece of paper, typed in bold font, "Drop the claim, or everything burns with you." I sat down on the floor, hands trembling, not just because of the threat, but because for the first time I realized Alan wasn't just a ghost from the past. He was still watching, still waiting, and now he was coming for me again. I hadn't realized how deeply fear could settle into your bones until it became your second heartbeat. That white envelope, with its faceless threat, had shattered whatever illusion of safety remained in my home. I carried it to the police station the next morning, clutching it like a burning coal. They took it seriously, opened a case file, promised a follow-up, but I knew better than to trust words without action. That night, I barely slept. When I did, my dreams stitched together the ghosts I'd tried to bury. My mother stood in the doorway of my childhood bedroom, arms crossed, her mouth a thin, silent line. Behind her, Alan stood in shadow, whispering Violet's name again and again like a hymn. In the dream, I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I just watched Violet walk toward them, hand outstretched. I woke up soaked in sweat. The next day, Caleb came by with something in his truck bed. "Cameras," he said simply. "Front and back, motion sensors. You shouldn't be living like you're waiting to be ambushed." I didn't argue. I didn't even thank him. I just nodded as he got to work, drilling and wiring while I stood on the porch, arms crossed against the wind. There was a subtle comfort in his presence, unobtrusive, steady, the kind of man who didn't say much but saw everything. While he worked, Violet came outside, wrapped in one of my old sweaters. "What's going on?" she asked. "Security," I said, "because someone threatened me." Her eyes dropped. "That wasn't me." "No," I said, "but you made the call that led him here." She looked like she'd been slapped. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I didn't tell him to come, I said I was in trouble. I didn't think he'd find us." "You didn't think, period." I regretted the sharpness of it as soon as it left my mouth, but regret didn't mean I was wrong. Later that night, she stood in the doorway of my bedroom, arms limp at her sides. "I'm sorry," she said. "I told him we were in Ohio. That's all." I swear I looked at her, really looked. Not at my daughter, but at a woman teetering between trauma and truth. "We're not safe anymore," I said, "which means we live by new rules." She nodded slowly. "No more contact with Alan, no more excuses. I want curfews, full transparency. And if anything makes me feel unsafe, you leave." Her eyes welled. "You'd kick me out?" "If you can't choose me over him," I said, "then I will choose myself." The words shocked me, not because they were cruel, but because they were true, and for the first time, I believed them. She didn't argue. The next morning, I found her at the kitchen table, pen in hand, a stack of blank papers before her. "What are you doing?" I asked. She looked up, startled, then held up the page. A letter, for the baby I didn't speak, just pulled out a chair and sat across from her. She continued, her voice soft. "I want them to know who I was before I was ready, what I learned, what I hope they'll never have to unlearn." It wasn't redemption, but it was a start. Each day after, she wrote more. Letters she folded neatly and placed in a small box she kept by her bed. I never read them. I didn't need to. The act alone was enough. A promise to the future she hadn't yet destroyed. Meanwhile, I made changes of my own. I changed every password from the bank to the Wi-Fi. I installed keypad locks on the doors. I stopped leaving the windows open. My home stopped being soft. It became something armored. At first, it felt like defeat, fortifying my world like I was preparing for war. But slowly, it started to feel like power, like control, like survival. One evening, Caleb came by to check the system. Violet was out. The baby box was on the table. "She's different," he said, adjusting the monitor. "Still damaged, but trying?" "Trying," I echoed. "It's all any of us can do." He lingered in the doorway after he finished, his eyes scanning the yard. "He's not done," he said finally. "Men like him don't know how to lose." "I'm not losing this time," I replied. He nodded and left. That night, I sat by the window with a journal in my lap. I wrote a single sentence: I no longer live in a house ruled by ghosts, and I meant it. It started with Caleb's voice, tight and urgent, crackling through the phone like fire through dry leaves. He's here. I saw him. I stopped breathing. The room, the walls, the floor, they all disappeared under my feet. Only his name echoed in my ears. Alan? Driving a dark SUV, circling the block. I walked up to him, asked him what he was doing. He smiled, Linda. Smiled. Then he hit me. My heart clamped in my chest. Are you hurt? I filed a report. The cops are looking for him now. But you and Violet need to leave. Tonight. I didn't waste a second. I hung up, grabbed my keys, and told Violet to pack a bag. What's going on? She asked, clutching the box of letters she'd written for her unborn child. Alan's here. He assaulted Caleb. We're going to Rachel's. Her face went white. We drove in silence, the road slick with fog. The air between us was thick with the words we hadn't yet said. Rachel opened her door before I knocked, ushering us in with a look that said everything. Inside, the world felt quieter, safer, but not for long. Later that night, I stood in her kitchen holding a porcelain teacup with both hands, my fingers trembling. I couldn't stop staring into the dark liquid. It reminded me of blood. Behind me, Violet sat at the table, her arms crossed, jaw tight. I turned slowly to face her. Why did you go to him? I asked. Not with rage, not with accusation, just exhaustion. Her eyes flicked to mine, then away. Because you always seemed like you wanted me to be someone else, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Smarter, kinder, less like him, and I never could be. So I figured, maybe if I went to him, I could find the part of me you hated. It was a gut punch, not because she was wrong, but because part of it was true. I'd spent so long trying to cleanse every trace of Alan from our lives that I hadn't seen how I'd turned Violet into a battleground. Every time I flinched at her temper or bit my tongue when she lied, I was reacting not to her, but to him, and she'd felt it, all of it. I sat down across from her, setting the teacup aside before it shattered in my hands. I don't hate you, I said. I hate what he left behind, what I let stay too long, but that was never you. She looked at me then, eyes glossy but grounded. I want to help. I'll give a statement. You don't have to. I do. For me, for the baby, for everything we let him break. The next day, we went together to the police station. Violet's voice didn't shake as she described Alan's manipulation, his coercion, the money, the messages, the lies. I want him held accountable, she said. It was the first time I'd seen her speak without apology. The detective nodded. We'll pursue full charges. We have enough for fraud, harassment, and assault. When we returned to Rachel's, there was a stillness between us that felt different. Not distance, but space. Breathing room. A shared silence that no longer felt like avoidance. We stayed another 2 nights. I cooked, Rachel cleaned. Violet wrote more letters. For a moment, the world seemed to pause, but peace never lingers long in places built on trauma. On the 3rd night, I found her phone left on the kitchen counter. The screen was still lit, a message thread open with a rental agency. Ready to move in by end of next week. Will handle utilities myself. Please don't contact the cosigner directly. I stared at it until the screen dimmed. Then I read it again. She was planning to leave, without telling me. I stood there, stunned, the weight of it pressing on my chest like a stone. It wasn't the leaving that hurt. It was the secrecy. After everything. I didn't say anything about the message the night I saw it. I went to bed as if nothing had changed, though my heart pressed against my ribs like it was trying to escape. I lay there in the dark, listening to the low hum of the streetlights outside Rachel's window, imagining Violet folding clothes into a suitcase when no one was looking, leaving in silence as if disappearing was her legacy. The next morning, I found her in the living room, folding one of the baby's onesies. The little garment looked like a ghost in her hands, something unfinished. You're moving out, I said, calm but not cold. She froze, her eyes flicking to mine, guilt blooming across her face. You saw the message. I did. She sat down slowly, setting the onesie on her lap. I was going to tell you. When? She didn't answer. I walked to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to let in the morning light. My voice came out softer than I expected. I just want to understand why. Violet stood, hugging her arms around herself. Because I need to try, to do this right, on my own. I don't want to keep living in the ruins of what happened between us, between you and him. I have to be different for her. For the baby, I turned to face her. You think I wanted you to stay broken? No, she said quickly, but I think maybe you needed me to, so you wouldn't feel alone in it. The honesty struck like a bell. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I nodded slowly because somewhere inside I'd known she was right. I had clung to the wreckage of us because it was familiar, even if it hurt. And now she was trying to row her own boat to shore. I'm proud of you, I said finally, and I'm scared. I am too. That night, I went online and found a local support group for trauma survivors. I wasn't sure what I was looking for: comfort, answers, or just a room where the silence was mutual. But I went. The group met every Tuesday in a church basement. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly, the coffee was lukewarm, and the chairs were mismatched. But the people looked like mirrors, bruised but upright. The group met every Tuesday in a church basement. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly, the coffee was lukewarm, and the chairs were mismatched. But the people looked like mirrors, bruised but upright. When it was my turn to speak, I hesitated. Then I started. My name is Linda. I'm a mother, a survivor, a woman who used to believe silence was safer than truth. And for a long time, I let that belief shape everything: my marriage, my parenting, my self-worth. The room held its breath. My daughter, she's leaving, and I'm learning to let her. Not because I don't love her, but because I finally do, fully, without conditions. A woman across the circle wiped a tear from her cheek. A man beside her nodded slowly. I felt lighter walking out than I did walking in. The next day, I took a spade and gloves and went out to Rachel's backyard. Her garden was overgrown, vines twisting through the fence like stories untold. I knelt down in the soil and began to clear space, sweat and memory mingling in the early light. My hands ached, but I didn't stop. Every pull of a weed felt like letting go. Later, Rachel found me there, dirt streaking my cheeks, a small green shoot in my palm. You planning something? She asked, crouching beside me. I think I am. She didn't speak, just started helping. And in the quiet rhythm of digging and planting, something between us mended. Not loudly, not ceremonially, just silently. In the following days, Violet began to pack. She didn't say much, and neither did I. We moved around each other like dancers learning a new choreography. Careful, respectful, uncertain. But something had shifted. Her touches were gentler, her voice softer. She didn't slam doors anymore. She let me help with the nursery, what little she was taking. Rachel painted the crib. I folded the tiny clothes. The day before she left, I walked past her room and saw her sitting on the bed, the box of letters open before her. She wasn't crying, she was reading. She looked up at me. Can I leave one with you? She asked. I nodded, and she handed me a sealed envelope. No name, just a date written across the front, 6 months from now. For when you miss me, she said. I'll always miss you, I replied. She smiled, the real kind, the kind I hadn't seen since she was a child. And for the first time in a long while, I believed we might just make it. Not as the people we were. The morning Violet left was quiet in a way I hadn't expected. No slamming of doors, no tears in the hallway. Just the rustle of her suitcase wheels over hardwood and the sound of her breath catching at the front door. I stood beside her, holding the last of her things, a soft blanket I'd kept since she was little. She turned to face me, a small wrapped package in her hands. I got you something, she said. I opened it slowly. It was a picture frame, simple, wood-grained, empty. For what's next, she said, not what was. My throat tightened, but I managed to nod. Thank you. We didn't say goodbye in the way movies would script it. No long embrace, no last-minute confessions. Just two women looking at each other across the space they had finally painfully learned to share. Her eyes glistened and mine mirrored them. Unspoken words passed between us. I watched from the window as she walked to the car, her belly slightly round beneath her coat. Rachel helped her load the last of her things. When she drove away, she didn't look back. And I didn't wait for her to. That night, the house exhaled. For the first time in months, I heard the silence not as tension, but as peace. I walked barefoot into the living room, sat on the couch, and let my body sink into the cushions. The walls didn't feel like they were closing in anymore. They felt like mine. I stared at the empty frame on the mantel. It looked oddly hopeful. In a voice I barely recognized, my own, I whispered, "Sometimes the hardest part of love is letting go." The next morning, I painted my bedroom. The walls had been the same pale blue for over a decade. Alan had chosen the color, back when I still believed compromise was the key to keeping a marriage intact. But as I rolled on a soft, warm cream, the room transformed. The light caught differently. My reflection in the mirror looked stronger. Maybe not whole, but healing. Later that week, Caleb stopped by with fresh coffee and a toolkit. "I figured you might need help rehanging that curtain rod," he said. We worked side by side in easy silence. No flirting, no expectations, just presence. Afterward, we sat on the porch, wrapped in quiet. "You okay?" he finally asked. "I don't know," I said, "but I'm not afraid of not knowing anymore." He smiled and leaned back in his chair. "That's a good place to be." As the wind moved through the trees, rustling branches like whispered reassurances, I realized I could breathe again. Not just in the physical sense, but deep in my chest, where the fear had been lodged for years. That evening, I opened the old filing cabinet in my office. The bank statements were still there, records of every sacrifice I had made, every dollar stretched, every plan postponed. I flipped through them slowly, remembering the weight each number carried. Then I placed them in a shredder and watched them disappear. Chapter closed. The night ended with no music, no distraction. Just the sound of wind outside my window, moving leaves along the porch and brushing softly against the shutters. It felt like the house was breathing too. Months passed. I kept writing, attended my support group, planted new flowers in Rachel's garden. Caleb came by sometimes. We didn't define it. That felt like freedom. Then one afternoon in early spring, I found a letter in the mailbox. No return address, just my name written in Violet's unmistakable handwriting. I opened it slowly, heart pounding. Inside, a single page, folded in thirds. "Dear Mom, I'm writing from rehab. I checked myself in last week. No one made me, not even the court. I just finally wanted to stop running. From everything. I thought leaving would make me free, but it turns out you don't outrun your past. You walk through it, and I'm starting to walk. Thank you for standing your ground. I hated you for it. But now I get it. I needed boundaries more than I needed rescue. I'll write again soon. Maybe visit if that's okay. I just wanted you to know. I'm trying. Love, Violet." I folded the letter, held it to my chest, and closed my eyes. It wasn't closure, but it was a beginning. I read the letter 5 times before I dared to say the words aloud. Sitting at my kitchen table, framed by early spring light, I unfolded the page again and let the sound of Violet's handwriting fill the room. "Dear Mom," I began, voice steady but hushed, like speaking to something sacred. "I'm writing from rehab. I checked myself in last week. No one made me, not even the court. I just finally wanted to stop running." The silence that followed was heavy, but not unbearable. It was the kind of silence that comes after a storm, not absence, but peace. I continued reading, her words flowing like water over old stones. "I thought leaving would make me free, but it turns out you don't outrun your past. You walk through it, and I'm starting to walk. Thank you for standing your ground. I hated you for it, but now I get it. I needed boundaries more than I needed rescue." By the time I reached the end, "I'm trying." My throat ached with unshed tears, not just of sorrow, but of strange, unexpected relief. Violet wasn't fixed. She wasn't finished, but she was beginning, and that meant everything. I folded the letter with care and slid it back into its envelope. My hands lingered on the crease. I thought of all the things I'd wanted her to say over the years: apologies, acknowledgments, gratitude, and how none of it ever came. Until now, and even this. It didn't feel like a reward. It felt like a mirror, one that finally showed me who we'd both become. That night, I sat down with pen and paper and began to write back. Not a letter of celebration, not an outpouring of advice, just a conversation. One mother to one woman. "Dear Violet," I wrote, "I've been planting again. The garden's fighting its way into color. You'd love the tulips this year, bright and stubborn, like you." I wrote slowly, deliberately, leaving space between the lines for air, for understanding. I told her I was proud, not because she was clean, but because she'd chosen the hard thing over the easy lie. I told her I missed her, that I hoped she kept writing, that I'd keep reading. I signed my name at the bottom. Not love, mom, just mom, because sometimes that's enough. The next morning, I walked the letter down to the post office instead of leaving it in the box. It was a longer walk than I remembered. My knees ached by the time I got there, but the rhythm of my steps was grounding. I dropped the envelope into the chute, exhaled, and turned back toward home. On the way, I paused at the corner of the park, watching two kids chase each other across the grass, their laughter light and wild. For a brief second, I thought of Violet at 6, in pigtails and muddy shoes, yelling for me to watch as she climbed a tree she wasn't supposed to. She never asked for permission, just forgiveness. And I had always given it, until now. Now I had asked something else: responsibility. When I got home, Rachel was waiting in the kitchen, arms crossed, and that sly smile playing at the corner of her mouth. "Happy almost birthday," she said. I blinked. "That's tomorrow." "I know, but we figured you could use a little warmth tonight." "We." Caleb stepped out from the back door holding a small chocolate cake, complete with uneven candles and a crooked smile. I laughed, something honest and full. We sat around the table, the three of us, not making a big deal of it. Rachel poured wine. Caleb told a joke that made no sense but somehow still landed. The house didn't echo like it used to. It felt filled but not crowded. At one point, Rachel reached across the table and touched my hand. "You've come back to yourself," she said. I looked down, unsure whether to cry or smile. I chose the latter. "Not all the way," I said, "but close enough to recognize me again." Later, after they left and the candles had melted into puddles of wax, I sat alone on the porch wrapped in a shawl. The night was cool, but not unfriendly. The stars were faint behind passing clouds. Somewhere Violet was doing the work, and so was I. I wasn't healed, not entirely, but I was whole. It was the condition that started everything, the only one I made when Violet knocked on my door with her life in ruins, her face gaunt, her eyes too heavy for someone her age. Truth, that was all I asked for. Not money back, not apologies, not promises, just truth. I remember saying it to her on the porch, her fingers white around the handle of her duffel bag. "If you want to stay here, if you want me to help, then I need honesty. Total honesty. No lies. That's the only condition." She'd hesitated, then nodded. But I know now that she didn't understand what it meant. Not then. Truth isn't just about facts. It's about reckoning, about opening every dark room in your heart and letting light pour in. And I had to do it too. Months later, I found myself sitting across from a therapist for the first time in over 20 years. Not for Violet, for me. The office was plain, light blue walls, a small window, a humming air purifier in the corner. I sat in the chair, hands folded in my lap, my eyes on the carpet. "My daughter stole from me," I began, "but it's not about the money." The therapist, Catherine, a calm-eyed woman with soft gray curls, just nodded, pen in hand. "It's about the story behind it," I continued. "How she got to a place where taking everything I had felt easier than asking for help. How I let that happen. How I built a life where that was possible." And then I told her everything, about Alan, about my mother, about the way silence stitched itself into the fabric of my bones until it was the only language I knew, about the night Violet was born and the way I looked at her and swore I'd do everything differently. and how slowly, tragically, I became the very thing I feared. I loved her, I said, but I loved her through fear, through desperation, through the echo of what had been done to me. I didn't cry. I just spoke, and when I finished, Catherine looked at me and said, "You didn't fail her. You loved her with the tools you had. Now you're learning new ones." Weeks later, on a soft April morning, a letter arrived in the mailbox. No return address, just the same loopy handwriting. Inside, a photograph. Violet, holding a newborn swaddled in a green blanket. Her eyes were tired, but her smile was real. Behind her, a sunlit window, a shelf filled with books, a plant blooming in the corner. She looked safe. I sat down on the steps of the porch, the photo shaking in my hands. The tears came, but not from grief, not from sadness, from release. I had waited for this, not the image, but the feeling it brought. Not victory, not vindication, just peace. That night, I pulled out my journal, the one Rachel had given me, the one I'd filled with everything, my doubts, my hopes, my shame, my healing. I wrote one last entry. Today I saw her, not the child I raised, but the woman she became, and she is more than I feared. She is more than I hoped. She is herself, and I love her. I closed the book gently and stood. In the hallway, the bookshelf stood against the wall, newly reorganized. At the very top, I slid the journal into a narrow space between two novels and placed a small handwritten label beneath it. Beginning again. The house was quiet, no static in the walls, no ghosts in the corners. I opened the front door and stepped into the golden afternoon light. The sun hit my face, warm and soft, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't flinch. I walked down the porch steps, no destination in mind. Just forward, no longer surviving, becoming. If this story cracks something open in you, stay with us. Because the hardest truths often live behind closed doors, and we're just getting started. Every family has its fractures. We explore what breaks, what heals, and what haunts. You've met Linda, but there are more voices waiting to be heard. Keep watching. The real stories never end where you think they will.